Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato.
Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know this is a very difficult time for many of us. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move to the show. I'm really pleased to be welcoming Alan Senauke to today's episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. Alan, thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and we'll see where we go.
Yes, we will. So I should mention the first time we met, actually the only time in person, was at Sabai Sabai, a Thai restaurant on Inya Road in Yangon in 2009. And little did I know how conditions would bring us together in this past year after that dinner so long ago. But in any case, we've been trying to hook up for months, and I'm so looking forward to the conversation that follows. I want to begin by telegraphing to listeners that we will eventually be discussing how you're leading and involved with engaged Buddhists around the world to respond to this crisis in Burma. Through your own organization of the Clear View Project, as well as through the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, or INEB. But before landing there, I want to go back through your intersecting spiritual and political biography to explore what has gone into informing your current activism and advocacy. And I don't know how we're going to fit this all in, so let's just start, because you have quite a full and robust background before now. So to start with, you grew up in a Jewish home in Brooklyn and went on to attend Ivy League school back east, and eventually became involved in the issues of the day. You eventually became involved in the issues of the day, including anti-nuclear and civil rights causes. Those were your first political engagements, and that initially led you to move from New York to California, to Berkeley to be specific. So can you tell me more about the reasons behind that move?
Sure. Well, actually, I had begun doing that kind of engagement in high school, and it continued through college. The move to California was not so much to pursue political directions. It actually was to pursue literary directions. But by that point in time, my circle of poets and writers, which had all of whom we had been involved in the Columbia University strike in 1968, we came out to California because that's where things were happening. But we, at that point, had a forming but integral understanding of literature, creativity, and social change. And it was a very dynamic time when we thought that revolution was in the air.
Right. And did you find it to be in the air?
Well, it was in the air, but it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of things happened. There were changes in the culture, and there were also very powerful repressive forces that were unleashed, particularly against communities of color, but also against any kinds of organization on the left. And we felt that, as others did. So, yes, that was a very clear. It was a very clear experience.
And while doing some research for the interview, I was really struck by how many touchstones in your life were familiar to me. And I actually grew up in Northern California, about 2 hours north of the Bay Area. But my first experiences in Berkeley on Telegraph Avenue, specifically in the 1990s, it was like a different world that opened up for me when I started going there. You actually moved across the country to Berkeley, and you settled there really in its heyday. When I was coming there in the 90s, I was only hearing about some of the stuff that used to happen there through friends and family that were there at the time. So can you describe what Berkeley was like when you arrived?
Well, we arrived in Berkeley in the summer of 1968 and then went back to New York. And when I came out west again about 2 years later, we moved to San Francisco. But Berkeley in the summer of 1968 was a police state. It was really scary. We thought we were coming to liberated California, and there were tremendous tensions in the street. We lived near Telegraph Avenue. There were groups of police parading down the street. There was curfew. It was a very tense time.
Wow. So how did you learn how to operate in that environment, and how did the police state manifest itself during your stay there?
Well, I think it manifested itself. I was not involved in any street conflict at that time, and we were only here for a short time, and we were just enjoying other aspects of California, backpacking and so forth. But we were very aware of the feeling on the avenue, and it was not comfortable. But we went back to New York.
So there were all these different forces that were operating in Berkeley at the time, opposing forces. And then another force that was happening aside from this kind of political division was that you got your first taste of Buddhist meditation in the form of Zen at this time. So can you tell more about what this experience was like?
Right. Well, my friends and I had all been adventuring in mind-altering chemicals, and that was we always saw that as an exploration, not as a means of just getting high. And it also got, in some sense, tedious. And we began to think that there must be other avenues to experiencing reality, to tasting reality. And around that time, an excellent book by Philip Kapleau, The Three Pillars of Zen, came out. And we read that. And that was the first book on Zen that actually described it as something that you did with your body. I mean, there was Alan Watts' The Way of Zen. There were books by D.T. Suzuki. But all of those were sort of philosophical and aesthetic, not yogic, if you will.
Sure.
And we came out here and we decided we would try to explore what Zen resources there were. And we found the Berkeley Zen Center and sat there some days, and also sat at Sokoji, which was the Zen temple in San Francisco, where Suzuki Roshi founded San Francisco Zen Center. And we kind of went back and forth across the bay over the course of that summer. And that was really important. That was a seed that was planted for me.
That's interesting, that dichotomy you make between the more philosophical or just the intellectual properties of Zen with the actual practice and where it fits in the actual body.
Right. There's actually another side too, which we were aware of, which is you might call beat Zen, which was a perspective on Zen that was being generated by some of the beat poets, which was really Zen is freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Zen is freedom to do whatever you wanted. And we were sorting this out, but we were sorting it out by actually taking up the practice.
Right. And with that mention of beat Zen, I have to go a little off script and just ask one question out of personal interest, or rather personal fascination, maybe a more accurate way to put it. I know you've crossed circles with Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg, and as someone whose life was shaped in more ways than I can describe by Jack Kerouac, I'm really curious how you would characterize his understanding and practice of Buddhism.
It's hard for me to say. I mean, Kerouac was somebody who really seemed to get at the essences of things, and yet they didn't free him. Which is really painful.
Yeah.
And I think in part that's because he lacked a teacher. Mm-hmm. He lacked a sangha. He was really focusing on the Buddha as the expression of liberation. But as we know from practicing, that there are three treasures: Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And they're all really essential. And so he's not somebody I knew. I did know Alan quite well. I know Gary and Phil Whalen. And all of them, to one degree or other, did recognize the triple treasure. And I think that it sustained them through their lives.
So you think that collection of beat poets and writers who also had a Buddhist practice, that it was more than a kind of passing or superficial interest? Because one of the criticisms you do hear is that when certain Eastern philosophies came to the US, and especially as they were picked up by people that were of a more higher profile, that they were more just kind of touching, especially some of those Indian gurus, that they were more kind of touching at the edges and cherry picking what they chose and how they applied it. But for the group of people that you were closely in touch with, you felt that there was really a genuine experience of practice and understanding among many.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Gary lived in Japan for many years. He studied with a very rigorous Rinzai Zen teacher. Philip was a student of Suzuki Roshi's and was himself a priest. And Alan was a very long-term student of Tibetan Buddhism. So they knew their stuff.
That's great. I like many people, when I grew up, I learned about some of these Eastern influences through the musicians and writers that I was following. And then as I got deeper into practice, I would come out and look again at how they had understood some of the influences and feel that it was more superficial than I'd remembered, because at the time I'd heard of it, it was so new. And when I did a reread recently of Dharma Bums by Kerouac, I was actually pleasantly surprised how much it still stood up. I was expecting to see a lot of kind of my deeper practice informing me of more of the things he didn't understand, but rather I was floored by how someone of his background and his time was writing in the way that he was. And I just adored Kerouac. And that's why it also breaks my heart so much to see those older pictures of him and to know the alcoholism and the bitterness that he developed into. And I think you put it just brilliantly, that someone that seemed he was really genuinely trying to get at the essence of this in a time when so many weren't, and yet somehow it didn't liberate him.
And there are other artists like that. There are people, there's Laurie Anderson in present time. There was Peter Matheson, who was a very, very strong practitioner and himself became a Zen teacher. And all of them, I feel like these are people who really went deep.
Yeah, that's great. So getting back to this Three Pillars of Zen, I found it interesting that later one of the issues you had with the book, and really an entire form of Buddhist practice in general, was what you described as, quote, the overt valorization of Satori, end quote. Can you describe more what you meant by this and what was unappealing?
Well, what I meant by it was very simple at the time. At the time, I was 20 years old, and I had been in a highly competitive high school. And then, even though I wasn't competing in a highly competitive academic environment, and there was an unconscious message that I was supposed to succeed at things. And so far, I had done okay in that respect. But I really wasn't interested in setting some more goals. I wasn't interested in a practice that was about accomplishing something. And in fact, at that time, I wasn't aware that the school that I had taken up with was also, one of the watchwords of the school was no gaining idea. And that was a very different orientation than the style of practice and the emphasis that you found at Rochester Zen Center. And I didn't know that at the time, because I never asked anybody at Berkeley Zen Center. So I sort of missed that, and I had to come back and find it the second time around.
Right. Elsewhere, you described it as the difference between gaining and no gaining.
Right. And this is a live, and I think it's a very fruitful dynamic tension within Zen, and it's live. To be honest with you, it's a live discussion in my household because my son just returned from a year and a half at a Rinzai monastery in Japan. And now he's immersing himself in our style of practice, and it's a live dialogue with him. And then he and I speak of it a lot.
So this is like a dynamic between a more concentrative and inward style of meditation and one that is more responsive and outwardly open.
That's exactly right.
Right. And it sounds like you've landed more on the latter. Is that fair to say?
I think that the emphasis in Sōtō Zen is on a practice that is quite receptive and fluid. Concentration is always a factor, but it's a factor. It's actually one of the factors of enlightenment. And you need some degree of concentration, but the Sōtō practice itself is generally not a concentration practice. It's more of an open awareness practice.
And you're, of course, referring more to Zen. If we look in Theravada, the same dynamic exists.
And, what's become what we call Vipassana now was actually part of a Buddhist revival going back at least to the late 19th century. But I wouldn't say it's inauthentic. It's just another manifestation of Buddhism, in the same way that you wouldn't say necessarily that Shin Buddhism or Nichiren Buddhism and Dogen, they all arose in 13th century Japan, and they were all movements to make the practice a practice that was obscure more accessible.
So I'm wondering, whether you're looking at these more structured experiences in Theravada, such as Goenka, or in the Zen world, as when you first became involved. Do you find these kinds of courses problematic in any way, or do you think there's a role for them, but they need to be balanced with something else?
I don't think they're problematic. For some reason, what comes to mind is somebody asking Frank Sinatra what he relies on. And he said something to the effect, whatever gets me through the night.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way I feel. Different people respond to these various practices according to some mysterious qualities that we have in us. And what I'm interested in really is how do they help us be open to ourselves, open to each other, and benefit the world. Every one of these practices has the capacity for that, because they're just about, all of them are about opening our awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that the more of these types of experiences that can be found outside of traditional Buddhist societies is great, because I've lived in Myanmar for 15 years. And one of the things that has really impressed me in being integrated into a living Buddhist society is the amount of options that are available, the amount of places that you can go to learn, how much you could learn, how much, the extent to which you can decide how much you want to be involved to this level or that level, and really being able to mold and shape your spiritual life according to all the different traditions and opportunities that are there, and then going to the West and seeing the much more diminished possibilities there. It's really on the student to try to fit him or herself into those existing formats. And so I think the more that those opportunities exist for the practitioner to decide where they want to place themselves, it really can just be beneficial.
Well, but you can also consider that there may be more living traditions of Buddhism available in California today than any place in the world.
Maybe.
Ever. I mean, basically, every tradition is alive here. But being Americans, we're often given to shopping around.
Right.
And that can be problematic. I was really lucky. I was so lucky. The first place I landed to do practice was Berkeley Zen Center. 15 years later, when I was really ready to take up practice and I returned, I was back in Berkeley and I returned to Berkeley Zen Center. And that was it. That's been my route and my home. But I also have I have a curious mind, and I had a teacher who gave me a very wide field. And so he really allowed me to explore a range of practices, to explore Buddhism in the wider world. And that interests me quite a bit. That's just the way my mind works. But as far as the core teaching and core practices is it.
And you reference how you went to California, you then moved back to New York, you came back a number of years later and went to the same Zen center. And according to my understanding, through that time, you also got involved in a couple other activities that influenced you to come back to Zen. You became involved more in music, in psychedelics, as you mentioned before, and in psychotherapy as well. So what role did you find these different activities playing in reconnecting you with that formal Buddhist practice?
Well, on the one hand, being a musician is really about paying attention. And particularly it's about music that I play has always been social. I've always played it with people. So you really have to pay attention to your interaction, your personal interaction and your musical interaction with those around you. And I love that. That was always such a great pleasure for me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one side. The other side is that as a professional or as an attempting professional, and as a person, these pursuits, politics, music, psychotherapy, were not completing a picture. They were not answering a really fundamental question for me of what I was doing on the planet. And that's what led me back to Zen.
And another thing you mentioned that played a role was The Snow Leopard by Peter Mathiasson. And here again is a really interesting parallel to my own life. I read that book before I ever started meditation when I was just out of college. And that work played such an important part in my own later spiritual journey. I think if I have to put my finger on it, I was going through this period of immense suffering in the world. And I simply didn't think it was conceivable to gain some kind of acceptance into the intensity of the mental anguish I was going through at the time. And yet in that book, the author is trying to do just this. And the mere possibility of a struggle, as I read about it at the time, I still remember it hovered somewhere between the miraculous and kind of a fool's errand as I was processing this. So I don't think any answers were actually given to me when I was reading it, but there were certain questions that were framed that I've been working through the rest of my life. And I still remember when I read that. So I'm curious, how did The Snow Leopard impact you when you read it?
Well, it was very, I mean, first of all, it's a beautiful book and it's very moving, and he was in a very difficult place.
Yeah.
And he took on this task of finding a snow leopard. But I think that it was I've had this response in my life several times where I read something or I hear about somebody who's doing something, and there's an internal voice that says, I could do that. And I think more than anything else, that was what was catalyzing for me about that book. And I read about him sitting zazen in caves. I have no desire to go to caves in the Himalayas and sit zazen. But the sitting zazen, I thought, if he could do that there, I could do that here. And that was a motivating factor. And I'm grateful that I actually had an opportunity to tell Peter about that, which was felt really good and felt really complete to me.
What was his response?
Oh, it was very warm. I mean, was a just a non-assuming person, very ordinary in certain respects. I think he appreciated it. And we knew who each other was from our engaged Buddhist work. And that's it. I didn't expect anything. I just told him. But that was one of the things the two books that were inspiring to me at that particular moment was Snow Leopard and also The Empty Mirror by Jan van der Wettering, which is not a very encouraging picture of Zen practice, to tell you the truth, but it encouraged me. And then I found Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which hadn't been published when I was practicing last. And that was it. Yeah.
So through all of this story, it's hard to know where and how to begin talking about your overlapping political activities, whether to chart the political and spiritual on different paths or to treat them sequentially. So anyway, let's just take a moment and look at some of the issues of the day that were happening around your practice and how that fit into your emerging spirituality. I think this is not only integral to understanding your own life, but also is very relevant for the present day and what we're dealing with now. In an interview you did with Richard Bryan McDaniel, you noted that, quote, there was a tension between certainly doing Zen practice and the kind of socio-political demands that I felt as a young person, end quote. Can you say more about this tension?
Sure. I thought the spiritual was in one box and the political was in another box. And I did not at that point see the integration of the two, and I wasn't seeing anybody integrating them in what I was reading. This is going back to when I started practicing in the 60s. In point of fact, Gary Snyder was already doing this. There were people who were already doing it. Robert Aitken was, but I hadn't read those things. And when I came here in 84, there was already an evolved, engaged Buddhist organization, Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and there were perspectives that were being laid out. And I had kind of come to a burned out stage in my political praxis as of a few years before that. But those instincts and those understandings, ways of looking at the world were still there. And when I heard about Buddhist Peace Fellowship and read the newsletter, I felt, here are people doing what is just very logical to me. If we're talking about saving sentient beings, let's talk about saving sentient beings. And so that was available right away.
So you went on to join the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Did that?
Joined, I was kind of a lurker, I got the magazine. I didn't really go to meetings, but I was in touch with what was going on and generally aware of what was happening in the Buddhist world.
And what activities were they engaged with at the time?
I think they were really engaged with anti-military and anti-nuclear activities on the domestic front. And internationally, Buddhist Peace Fellowship was tuned into repression that was going on in Tibet, to religious discrimination and repression in Vietnam, in issues that were happening for Buddhist communities in Bangladesh. And so there was an internationalism to it.
And in describing what appealed to you about it in the same aforementioned interview, I was struck by how you used core Buddhist philosophy and understanding at trying to understand and look at the wider world systems. You were looking at the nature of suffering, and you said that, quote, the nature of suffering that Buddhism is so good at describing and working with, that nature was not individual, that it manifested individually, but that manifestation also had social dimensions. In other words, suffering was also related to systems of oppression, systems of suffering. And I think that is a common understanding for a small group of people. It was an uncommon understanding in the context of the general approach to Buddhism in the West and for the East, for that matter, end quote. So that quote really struck me, of how you were using Buddhist principles of suffering that were usually described in an individual way, in an individual basis, and one was led to understand through one's own immediate practice and awareness, and trying to apply them and understand how they would then operate and transmutate at the greater systematic level.
I've always tried to do that. My orientation is in many ways to Buddhist principles and practices and systems of thinking. So I'm interested in seeing how modern political thinking might manifest in Buddhist terms. And I saw, certainly among the leaders of engaged Buddhism, among Robert Aitken, Joanna Macy, Gary Snyder, Sulak Sivaraksa, Thich Nhat Hanh, they were all doing the same thing. And that was inspiring. And then there were, a circle of people in my generation and in my circles around BPF who were doing this, and we found each other. So that's just how I've operated for 30 years. And it makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the only way to look at things, but it's how I choose to look at things. And I will say, in reference to what you mentioned, when I came to Buddhist Peace Fellowship in 1991, I would say this kind of perspective was decidedly minority view of Buddhism, and often was looked on askance by other Buddhists who felt that this was leftism in Buddhist robes, not really Buddhism. And it's really different now. Here we are 30 years later, and a lot of these principles are much more integrated into Buddhist practice here and Buddhist practice in other places in the world. I mean, if you look today, I got a short video 2 days ago from the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which talks about the work that they've been doing in Myanmar for the last number of months.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, a section of this video which shows monks protesting, monks resisting the coup. And it's not that they learned that from the West.
Mm-hmm.
That's there in their tradition. But there's a coming together, I think, of Western political perspectives and Dharma perspectives that I think is very much alive.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think in Myanmar as well, there's certainly a history of the monastic involvement in various worldly affairs. That's obviously a debate going back from time immemorial of to what extent should monastics be involved or not involved. And in the nationalist struggles, there were many monks that played an important role during the British era. And I think that today, I mean, we see that in Myanmar on both sides of the aisle, both in terms of the monks that are protesting on the street and as well as those that are supportive of the anti-Islam and military sentiments and wanting to so-called offer a protection of Buddhism in their country. And I think that there certainly is today a wider acceptance and manifestation of what's been termed engaged Buddhism, that various practitioners are practicing in various forms. But I think there's also what you mentioned, how it's leftism masquerading as in robes and in practice. I think there's still those sediments that remain and are pretty prevalent to some degree. I think that one of the ways I see it manifested is not so much that expression of leftism masquerading as Buddhism, which I could certainly identify with and in hearing, but I hear more that it's that those practitioners who are choosing not to engage will take it almost as a mark of wisdom, almost as a mark of a deeper understanding of the conditions of samsara and the emphasis on the inner practice while the outer manifestations continue as they always have and as they always will. And so I've seen a kind of like scoffing or sarcasm or criticism of those that choose to engage as kind of a sign that they don't really understand Buddhist tenets or aren't as devoted to Buddhist practice as those who are focused more on the internal journey.
I think the central factor in monks' non-involvement at this point in time, and there are monks who are quite involved and very supportive of the NUG and of the CDM. I think the principal issue is fear. I think that they've been intimidated in the intervening years since the Saffron Revolution. We're talking about 14 years or so now. And at that point, they were unified, and they were encouraged by their own masses of numbers who were coming out in opposition to the junta, and in, I would say, in identity with the population, but also in recognition of the ways that, as monastics, they were directly affected by the precipitous price rises in basic substances, which meant people could not feed them. And, I hate to say it, but there was some self-interest that was involved in their protests, as well as larger interests and identity with the population. I think in subsequent years, the government, which seemed that it was on a kind of popularizing trend, I wouldn't say democratic, but was trying to build a popular connection with sectors, with popular sectors and the monastics, and I think they were very successful in. I think they've been very successful in co-opting the monastic communities, and also probably the monastic hierarchy, which is, as usual, kind of elderly and vulnerable. And I don't think that they have very many people who are actually really unpacking what we might think of as engaged Buddhism in Myanmar. There probably are a handful, but I think there are very few that are looking beyond the Burmese traditions, beyond whether it's the Abhidhammic tradition or the meditational traditions. They don't have a lot of input from the wider Buddhist world. And so they also they're not very much participating in a dialogue between the social elements of engaged Buddhism and their perception of the traditional forms. The other thing that comes to mind is, in terms of the distortion of the Sangha, is that we've lived with a tremendous upheaval in a nationalist tendency in Myanmar Buddhism that manifested in ethnic hatred. And that was widely supported. It was supported within the Sangha. It was supported within the public circles, and it was supported from within the government and the military. So that was part of I think the co-optational dimension of what's happened to the Sangha in the last 14, 15 years. That's very significant. And even though some of those voices have been nominally chastised, I suspect that those tendencies are still there.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points that you bring up, and taking us through the last 15 years. And on the one side, you have this rise of Buddhist nationalism, and we should mention that there have been progressive elements within the Burmese Buddhist monkhood that we just don't hear about, that just aren't reported as much in the West, and that the movements that are happening here are under, and especially now, enormous pressure and danger in terms of what they're doing. I mean, there was the whole White Rose movement, and this was a collection of Buddhist monks that would go into Muslim communities and give a white rose to the different Muslims as a sign of solidarity. And beyond that, there have also been stories of some of the worst riots that it was Buddhist monasteries that eventually ended up housing and shielding a lot of the Muslim communities that sought refuge there. So it is a bit more nuanced than sometimes you hear reported, but I do think that obviously now with the coup, that a much more aggressive etho-national type of jingoistic Buddhism is being promoted that promotes the Bamar nationhood and the nationalist goals, and is quite racist in its outlook as well. And I think there is a tension as the country has opened up that was probably to be expected, that as greater opportunities started to be found, there was competition with Buddhism. There was competition with the kinds of jobs and entertainment and travel opportunities and education and everything else that simply by having a society where there were almost no opportunities or distractions or diversions or anything anywhere, that there weren't too many games in town. And I think that was an understandable and even expected development that would come when the country started to open, but that it has made a kind of divide of who is going to be a lifelong Buddhist monk and who is not. And I think a lot of the people that are, a lot of the Burmese men that are now going to the monkhood are from communities that are more disadvantaged and have the opportunities haven't reached them, and there's more poverty. And I think that from those middle class urban families, I think it would be very odd for a young man to decide to not pursue a worldly path of livelihood and family and everything else, and instead be a lifelong monk. I don't really know of any examples from the modern day where that's happened. Of course, they still go to monks, they still practice meditation, they might still practice the precepts, they would ordain temporarily, but in terms of lifelong monks, not as much. And so that is making a divide between the reality that the monkhood has and their issues and their understanding, and the new direction that a lot of the younger generation is going, where they have less in common. They have less of a shared reality than they certainly did 10 years ago. And I think that we're seeing that manifested in some of the comments and feelings of that younger generation. And a couple examples I'll give. One is that after the interview I did with Bhikkhu Bodhi, I was contacted by a young Burmese man who heard the interview and was very inspired, and we ended up having a lengthy email conversation, and he explained to me that he felt one of the problems that we were now facing, and what he called the absolute failure of the Burmese Sangha, was that they simply refused to modernize. They refused to be progressive in any way. And as someone who had been a monk and whose friends were currently monks, the things that he was pushing for many years to have greater modernization of what they were doing, how they were thinking, keeping, of course, the tenets of what it means to be a monk, but just being a bit more aware of moving into a new era, that simply wasn't happening. And that closed-mindedness led to what we're seeing now of these traditional old guards. And I think where that leaves us off right now with the current Burmese generation in relation to their monkhood is that from the young activists that I speak to, this is kind of the culmination in a feeling that the Sangha has shown itself to be irrelevant and irreconcilable to their life, that at the time that they most need the support of a kind of third rail of Burmese society that can do things that no one else can, for the most part, they've been largely silent. In some ways, I think there's been a vocal minority who's actually been supportive of what the military is doing. And so I think this is kind of the culmination of many years of this young generation growing up with different opportunities and having a greater divide between the monastic experience. And given this time of such extraordinary need, I think at the beginning there was there was a mix between anger and hope and disappointment and persistence in terms of wanting to encourage them to engage. There was a mix of these feelings that I saw in February and March. And sometime after March or April, they've just become a non-factor. They've just become something that if these people aren't going to do anything, we don't need them, and let's move beyond them and let's create our own reality. And I think this brings up a fascinating and, also perilous reflection on what does this mean in the future. Obviously, it's going to matter whether the democracy movement wins or the military stays in control. But either way, this is creating and widening fault lines within Burmese Buddhism and the lay Sangha relationship that I've never heard of or seen in centuries, in millennia of the history that I've read, in terms of where this younger generation is going. And it's completely understandable that they would make those evaluations, that these guys are completely worthless. They're completely irrelevant for the aims that we have. They are not doing anything to help. And if they're going to leave them behind and see them as unnecessary in this moment, is that going to change? Are they going to come back and start to feel that they then have a place? Or is this just going to be the start of something that widens, that is forevermore changed as a result?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the unity that was manifest in the Saffron Revolution has been replaced by the unity of, forces led by Wiratu, 969, Mabata. That's a new kind of unity, and it is. It's happening, as you say. It's happening within this opening of the country, and the country it's radically different than when I first went there, and the young people are different. The young people are exposed to influences from everywhere, and they are very hip. And the monastics are hiding out. They're hiding their heads, for the most part, hiding their heads under a rock, with some exceptions. But the exceptions don't really have any power. They're not located in positions of authority in the training monasteries or in the hierarchy. And this is why I think that young people, for the first time, is very different than in 2007. They're saying we don't need this. We don't need this kind of Buddhism. And I've been speaking to people who are actually interested in other modalities of Buddhism, and are just really, for the first time, dipping their toes into other waters.
Yeah.
So I think that the monastics are probably frightened. They were frightened. That fear was manifest in this kind of radical nationalism of Wiratu. But it's not going to go anywhere. And I don't have, without substantial change, I don't have a lot of encouraging thoughts about the Sangha in Myanmar.
Yeah, and I think traditionally some of the older guard has had a mindset that we need to keep the status quo. We have this responsibility, this traditional lay monastic relationship that has been defined, and we need to make sure it's upheld under changing times and whatever, not be caught up in the moment. And so there's a real conservative and traditional focus on wanting to preserve and strengthen these monastic and Buddhist traditions no matter what. But it's having this counterintuitive effect, because by holding so closely to a teaching as people's lives and freedoms are literally at risk, by the attempt to try to hold on and preserve those, they're actually taking the action which is going to most encourage their irrelevance and lack of engagement and practice from those people, because they're not responding to the needs of the moment. They're showing themselves as completely tone deaf about what people need. And this is really a shame, because this is not what has always happened through different other turbulent stages of Burmese Buddhist history. There have been, especially when you look at the colonial era and when you look at all the period of the warring states and the kingdoms and everything else, there have been very shifting times before, not quite like this, but shifting in other ways. And there have been ways to respond to that moment before. The greatest example you can put there is Lady Sayadaw, and what Lady Sayadaw was able to do at the time of the British and the colonial period to take the core of the classic and traditional teachings as he understood them, and yet adapt them and bring them into a dynamic way of use, into a greater audience and practicality that had never been seen before.
Was that, my curiosity is, was that influence within the Sangha or within the society? How deeply the changes that he brought in, particularly in terms of making Buddhist practice available to lay people, how deeply did that reach into the structure of the Sangha itself?
I think it reformulated the entire lay Sangha relationship, because at that time you had the king and the ministers who were responsible for the upkeep and the administration of the Sangha. And the king had been deposed. There was no more royal court. And so there was a question of what becomes the new lay Sangha relationship now that this thing has been removed? In some ways, you could even say that this was a scarier time and had more potential catastrophe then than even now, because this was centuries and centuries of a royal Sangha relationship with the people underneath both of them. And one of these components had been removed. And so Lady had to reformulate how the entire monkhood would then relate to the people, and did so in a number of extraordinary dynamic ways that would take another several-hour podcast to go into. But the point is that he was able to draw upon a classic understanding of Buddhism at a depth level. So he wasn't making a new religion. He wasn't making sacrifices or negotiating key parts of the Buddhist experience. He was relying on this classical understanding, but he was so dynamic and flexible in how he was able to give people new tools for interacting with it. And that's what we need now, and that's what we're not getting.
Well, obviously, I mean, I would imagine that in the conversation with Bhikkhu Bodhi, he pointed to resources within the tradition that could be utilized. And, I think that there's been a choice made. It's not that the monastic order are necessarily irrelevant. It's that they have chosen in this moment to take the wrong side, in my estimation. And interestingly, we have an example 14 years ago of them using aspects of the tradition to take a stand with people. And as I said, I feel that they have been co-opted and bribed and frightened into a corner. And to stand there in this corner is for them to consign themselves to irrelevance.
Yeah, and in no way do I mean to suggest that the Burmese monkhood is irrelevant. The point is that they have shown themselves to be irrelevant in the eyes of the younger generation, that is, their lives and freedom are at stake, and this old guard that they've never really maybe understood as their previous generations did, and the gap was already widening to this point as they had greater work and educational and travel opportunities that the much in the monkhood does not. Even still, that this has culminated into them just as I mentioned, the first couple months seeing this range of emotions, and then after April, they've just become a non-entity. I talked to hundreds of Burmese activists in all kinds of ways that are engaged in all kinds of activities, and basically no one talks to me about the monks anymore. No one ever brings it up. No one cares. When I bring it up, they don't have anything to say. They kind of think I'm the weird foreigner, that why am I so focused on this? And why is this something on my mind? And at the same time, I know that their parents and the older generation still have that sense of reverence, if it might be hurt or confused or whatnot. But for the younger generation, they don't really see a point of even having that in the conversation anymore.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And
yes.
Whether that is going to somehow be rectified is really still to be determined. It could be, but I'm not seeing any signs of it.
Yeah. Well, there are some pretty dynamic, progressive monastic leaders, but of course they don't have freedom.
Structurally.
Yes, I know. Right. Yeah, I agree with you completely. And also it takes a very special kind of monk, because a monk, by constraints of their position, they cannot be a full activist. No one is calling for that. They can't just wear the monk robes and do whatever they want. There's a certain kind of marriage you have to have between your dedication to monastic discipline and understanding the Vinaya and the rules, and knowing with the limits inherent in the life that you've chosen, where can you engage and where can you not? Because you're not just free to do anything you want as a monk or a nun. Yeah, so we were talking a bit about the looking at engaged Buddhism, where it's existing or perhaps not existing in Myanmar now. Your life has really been centered on many aspects of engaged Buddhism, largely in the West. I wonder if you can describe for listeners what engaged Buddhism means to you.
Sure. Engaged Buddhism, to me, is a way of looking at the world not through the eye of an individual, but through the eye of communities and societies and systems. So the suffering, most of the teaching that I've received is very clear in saying not so much that I am suffering, but that there is suffering. However, many of the structures of our meditational tradition, and I'm focusing on that, in various traditions, attend to suffering at the level of individual activity and individual karma. And I think that from the perspective of engaged Buddhism is one that sees that our societies are a fluid interdependence and dynamic between individuals who are operating in the context of a system or systems. Actually, almost always multiple systems. And so what we have are systems of suffering, and we can put names to them. We can talk about racism or sexism or any form of structural oppression that is not simply the suffering of one individual or of an accumulation of essentially individuals, but is something that whole communities or whole groups of people experience broadly and are caused to suffer from these systemic effects. And the other side of that is, as participants in these systems, we don't necessarily see our individual agency in the proliferation of a system. And so everything goes along in a sense of, with a sense of disconnect. So I think that engaged Buddhism, one way to look at it is really taking responsibility in the sense that each of us is completely responsible for everything that happens in the world. That's a broad expression, but by virtue of our participation in systems, and this is very, can be very simply described. If one gets in one's car, in one's gasoline-powered car, and goes out for a drive, we are making use, as individuals, we're making use of resources that have been extracted from the earth in other parts of the globe, and often extracted to the ends of great profit for the companies that are selling the oil, but incredible oppression to the people who are working in the oil fields or who are digging in the coal mines. And we live our lives at the expense of theirs. So engaged Buddhism to me is really looking at the wide picture, or the wide view of interdependence, and taking responsibility for it.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I haven't heard it described quite in those terms. That's one of the most compelling definitions I've heard of it, and gives me a number of reflections in different directions of how you were able to define it. Going more into it, I want to pull from an interview you did a few years back with Richard McDaniel. There's one response you gave that I found really telling in how you describe this relationship between a spiritual practice of awareness, where many practitioners begin to see as largely internal, with this wider concern for others and the world. And in this interview, you said, "What I mean by awakened is awakened activity. I mean action that is premised on the oneness of our common humanity. Thereby, some fundamental kindness. To respect that kindness doesn't always mean that everything's nice and gentle, but means seeing the all-pervasive nature of Buddha's nature and really challenging yourself when you're not seeing it, which certainly comes up a lot in our social world. Nonetheless, even if I'm not seeing it in relation to this person or this situation, how do I want to act? That's where I come back to knowing where my feet are. How do I want to act in the face of this? That to me is enlightened activity. I tend to look at people, or evaluate, if you will, on the basis of what they do, what they say, and what they do. Because I don't really have any way of evaluating what type of meditative experiences they might have had. Also, I don't think that those experiences are necessarily transformative," end quote. So later you go on to quote Bernie Glassman, who himself is quoting Kobo Daishi, a 19th century Japanese, and saying, maybe. Maybe.
Okay. I have not been able to find, I have searched high and low for that quotation and have not been able to find it.
I see. The quote that you're referring to is, "One can tell the depth of a person's enlightenment by how they serve others," end quote, which is really just those dozen words or so are the synthesis of the much longer quote where you were reflecting and chewing on this. So you had mentioned how there was this terrific unresolved tension for you between the political causes for the day in the 1960s and 70s and your own inner practice. And yet when I read this reflection, it seems to express this remarkably clear understanding of how these two have perhaps come together. So is it fair to say that this is somewhat of a resolution of that initial tension?
I mean, I guess you could say that. I mean, I didn't have access to these ideas when I came to Buddhism. They weren't being spoken by many people. However, actually, the wonderful articulation of them was available as early as 1961 or 1962 from Gary Snyder, where he wrote a piece called Buddhist Anarchism, and he nailed it, and that was there. I could have read that, but I wasn't seeing it in our centers. And I wasn't deep enough into Buddhism or into Buddhist practice to be able to really integrate those. And to go back to Myanmar, my experience from really spending time with quite a few of the Saffron Revolution monks was their hearts were very much in the right place, but they did not have, I almost never met anybody who could express an integral view of Buddhism and society. And I think that that's something that engaged Buddhists have been developing, not just here. It's been developing in different places in Asia as well. But certainly this is something that my circle of friends and all the people I would say around international network of engaged Buddhists would have a fairly common understanding, although we might each articulate it in a different way. But this came to, when I really turned to Buddhism after having been exposed in the late 60s, when I turned to it in the mid 80s, I think that this understanding was already around. And, certainly I heard it from Aiken Roshi, I heard it from Joanna Macy, I heard it from Sulak Sivaraksa, from Thich Nhat Hanh. It was very much, there was an evolving perspective that was clearly articulated.
And as you retrace those movements that you were involved in your past history, these progressive movements of the 1960s, and then as they moved into the 1970s, they didn't entirely disavow nonviolence. And you yourself mentioned being involved in discussions where various forms of violence were bandied around, and activists were openly reflecting on if there were some cases where the means could justify the ends. But as someone who was waiting for the revolution, as you said yourself, and yet also becoming very involved in Buddhist practice, how did you come to reconcile these questions of the coming revolution and the role of violence, and yet your commitment to Buddhist practice at the same time?
Well, it came in two stages. The first was I really came to the end of having any faith in a violent revolution. At one point, it seemed like, at a point of desperation, it seemed like that was the only answer. And to the extent that people made efforts in that direction, it didn't work. It was self-destructive. It was destructive of others. And it stood no chance in the face of the massive repression that was mounted by U.S. government. And I just ran to the wall. I said, and realized actually from internal reflection that this is not who I am. I wasn't sure who I was, but I knew that this was not what I wanted to do or how I wanted to follow and to proceed. And as a matter of fact, somebody that I knew from Colombia who followed the logic of his thinking and participated in an armed robbery in which 3 people were killed. He was just released on parole after 40 years in prison. So there are other people I know. There are people I know who died in bomb factories. There are people I know who personally who went to prison for long years, and then there's so many people of color who were murdered for political reasons, who were repressed, whose lives were destroyed. And it was clear to me that this was not going to be a path for the transformation of this society.
Right. And looking at the situation now in Myanmar, looking at the state of terror that's there, I first want to ask you a question that is more or less identical to the question that I asked Bhikkhu Bodhi on that podcast. And I framed this question in advance by acknowledging the difficulty and the sensitivity in it. It's the kind of question where very likely there aren't any right answers. And so I'm not asking this to put you on the spot to come up with something that is probably not going to be very good one way or the other, but more as a open reflection about an actual life situation that people are being faced with now and understanding where Buddhist values and discipline fits into that. So before my conversation with Bhikkhu Bodhi, I surveyed my audience to ask what questions they had for him. And not surprisingly, there was an overwhelming number of questions that were inquiring about the role of harm at this moment, where many believe that they're approaching a kill or be killed type of scenario. And looking at this question is not really as black and white as one might think at first glance, because short of killing, there are a wide range of methods from self-defense to diversionary techniques to threats to sabotage, provoking mild injuries, before one gets into strict nonviolence and pacifism of any kind. And I'm now in touch with many dedicated practitioners in Myanmar who have had to contemplate things they would never have done in a million years, never have expected to. People who have been careful in their lives never even to harm a mosquito. And when they've killed an ant accidentally, they immediately send metta and retake the 5 precepts then and there. So what are your general thoughts of looking at where nonviolence has played a role in your life and the way you've seen societal change and your own Buddhist practice, understanding that that's happened within an American context, which is somewhat an American context in the 1960s, which would not exactly line up to Myanmar in 2021, and of their last 70 years of, aside from a brief transition period of having a terrible military dictatorship. What would you say generally as a guidance or a reflection to a Buddhist who's now facing these terrible circumstances there?
We can all, there's a expression in my tradition. One can only see as far as one's eye of practice reaches. So, first of all, I would say my opinion is just my opinion. And I'm far removed from the circumstance. And so I'm not evaluating or preaching in any way. This is a question that faced me and faced many of us who were involved with Burma and elsewhere. I reckoned with this question in the 1990s when you had the organization of, the continuing organization, because they already existed, of ethnic armies and of also sort of not pan-ethnic, but diverse military organizations. Or you had organizations like the All Burma Student Democratic Front, and they were involved in armed resistance, in some cases in military actions. And my feeling at the time was it was not for me to criticize them. I also didn't feel that I wanted to be part of any supply train for their actions. But I supported direct aid for the population, direct medical aid to whomever needed it, without distinguishing between a combatant and a non-combatant. In fact, without distinguishing about that on either side. So nowadays, my concern is it's kind of like what we experienced in the late 60s and early 70s. These are activities of principle. They are protest and quasi-armed or even guerrilla activities that are flowing from a sense of loss about what to do, and of great, great injury to those populations. And so I can understand it. Because other methods, approaches, to one extent, haven't been proliferated within the communities, but to another extent, they're not working. I don't think that, there have been ethnic groups that have been fighting wars with the Tatmadaw for 50 or 60 years. And, it's just a historical accumulation of losses. And there's been no victory, no concession. And the predominance of arms is in the hands of the government. And you have a very large army. They're very well trained, and they're completely willing to obey and direct that violence against their own people. That's very hard to combat. I think that the combat I'd like to see I'd like to see the country brought to a halt. And I'd like to see the external pressures coordinated, from those of us outside, from nations outside, really, really clearly coordinated with the internal mechanisms of non-cooperation and of social change. That I would hope, I think that's what's going to be effective in the long run. So what I said about one's practice, one's activities only going as far as the eye of practice can see. What you have in many places is a disciplined and trained manifestation of direct nonviolence. And when I say direct nonviolence, it's very distinct from this kind of passive resistance, which is a word that we heard when we were younger. It's active resistance. And it has consequences both on those who are acting upon, but also has consequences on oneself. It means, in a sense, taking the same kinds of risks that a militant soldier would. But it holds to the value of non-retaliation. My question is whether that is an effective tactic in an environment that so far has been very reluctant to limit the violence that it will impose on its own people.
It's very hard to imagine nonviolence working in Nazi Germany or North Korea or against the Imperial Japanese Army.
Exactly. Whereas, to some degree, and it's a dubious question historically whether nonviolence was really effective in India.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure, or whether this is just the tides of the time and the empire crumbled and couldn't hold on to it. It's recognized it just couldn't support its infrastructure in India, and so they split. That's one example. But there are places where you have really powerful models of nonviolence, but in all those places seemed like there were to some degree limits upon the violence that the state was willing to use.
Yeah. Well, the state had a different methodology. Those South Africa and England and British colonial England and U.S., these did not espouse fascist ideology. They espoused something different. So even though there were many imperfections and hypocrisies within what they said and what they did, there was at least a fallback on what they said they wanted to be that created that opening where nonviolence could show something to them back. But the fascist ideology just would see nonviolence as just pure weakness and something to be exploited and rooted out. And I've also read studies that looking at Mandela and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, that there were parallel violent movements that were striving for the same thing. And as those societies were reaching a tipping point and cracking and breaking apart, the nonviolent activists were much more appealing to the majority group that they saw a reason to work with them. And so it's really somewhat inaccurate, this argument goes, to look back and say, oh, these movements won because they were nonviolent, and this is such a pure principle, that it was actually, there was a more complicated contextual situation going on that without which these nonviolent movements, even in a non-fascist ideology, couldn't have been successful.
That's correct. Whether there was an openly coordinated strategy, which I don't think there was.
No.
But what you had were, to some degree, parallel tracks of activism. And what became clear in certain circumstances was, if you don't get this, you get this.
Yeah.
And I think that's possibly true in Myanmar.
Yeah.
At the same time as I'm not going to attack it, but it's not where my support lies.
Hmm.
And it's not where our, it's not the kind of aid that I feel I can participate in providing, military aid, and maybe that's shaving too fine a point, but it's also a place where one has to make choices about where one's action or funds go. At the same time as, I've been very careful. I'm not publicly, I wouldn't publicly criticize the resistance movement.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I wouldn't say that there are no circumstances under which I would take up a weapon. I can't say that.
And then there is a distinction between the kind of personal support, a support of understanding, of listening, of non-judgmental, of hearing where someone got to what they got to, and giving them a space to be able to share that, and having some line with what financially is actually supported. And as you were talking before, I just thought of your definition of engaged Buddhism, and that just came to mind, because when you're talking about engaged Buddhism, you're talking about your definition took responsibility not just for your actual actions, but for the system that you were living in, and that intentionally or unintentionally that you were supporting in some way. And what I mean by that is, when you look at history, a lot of us living in free societies today are enjoying this privilege because people that came before us passed through very bloody conflicts to get here. I think if you want to take the nearest example, you look at France, and you look at, like, what did those French resistance fighters in World War II have to do to secure freedom for their country? How much blood did they have on their hands? How many innocents did they sacrifice? How many mistakes did they make? What kind of trauma did they have to live with just a couple generations ago, so France could eventually get free of this evil?
It's also true, I think, that the so-called bad guys of the Tatmadaw are the sisters, are the brothers and sons of the people. It is just as it is with the monks. The monks and the Tatmadaw are the two largest institutions in Myanmar. And I really wonder and do not know what efforts are being made, what efforts are possible to actually bring elements of the military into awareness of the consequences of their actions. I can't but think that many of the rank and file soldiers are terribly conflicted about this. But we don't know. But I'd like to come back to something. There was a piece that Bhikkhu Bodhi wrote in an issue of Inquiring Mind that I co-edited. It was on war and peace, the issue. It was very interesting. It was an interesting accumulation of articles and perspectives. So in this column, which was very unusual, what Bhikkhu Bodhi said was, there was a small window of circumstance under which he could imagine the use of force. And this, then resulted in a very sharp debate between him and Ajahn Thanisaro. The circumstance that Bhikkhu Bodhi pointed to was the lead up to World War II, which was relatively long, relatively slow. And at a number of critical points, Hitler tested the other nations of Europe about how far he could go. Going into the Rhineland, going into Czechoslovakia, going into Poland, and each step. And what Bhikkhu Bodhi was saying was he could have been stopped by military action in one or another of those forays. And it was a failure of will, of vision, of understanding what was happening that led to the complete conflagration, which was disastrous on a scale that we couldn't understand. And what he was saying was that there's a place in which nations could have intervened and saved us from Armageddon. And of course, Ajahn Thanissaro said, this is completely not permitted in the context of the Dharma. And I'm not sure that that's actually true, because if you look at the Dharma, speaking of the duties of kings, one of the duties of kings is actually defense. So maybe the Sangha would not be expected to participate in this, but other people might. So anyway, I'm just reminded of that, and I'm curious, what was Bhikkhu Bodhi's answer to your question?
Putting me on the spot. I have to remember. Actually, the answer that I can give you is it's ongoing. I asked him various versions of that same question, and he wrestled with it in real time for 90 minutes and showed, in my opinion, enormous courage for being able to, from his position, speak on something in which he was not going to get it right, because no one can get it right. And you're just going to open yourself up. And he knew he was doing that, but he was engaging in that reflection because it was so important to bring the Dhamma into a practical experience. And we are going to have a follow-up discussion where he is going to continue to reflect and to go back and forth on these and to refine himself.
And, it's one of the reasons that I deeply respect him is that he doesn't take easy positions.
Mm.
He doesn't fall back on the doctrinaire.
Yes.
But at any rate, I do not have a conclusive answer to that. I think, this, in a sense, it's it's kind of contradicting what I said earlier about engaged
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
because it falls back. I have to come back to what would I do?
Yeah.
And reflect on what would I do? Where does my training lead me? And where personally am I willing to act? How am I willing to act?
I've referenced this on other episodes, but I was listening to a podcast with Tom Hanks, of all people, who's a World War II aficionado, and he was referencing a historian he read that was describing the French Resistance. This is when all society is broken down, evil has come and occupied your land, and everything is in disarray. And he was quoting this historian by saying that at this time, all French people had a choice of who they were going to become, and you had to be one of these three people. You were going to be a hero, a coward, or a bad guy. There was no middle ground. And I think, and that's a really astounding thing to step back and consider, that when you're forced into this kind of corner where you don't have any other option and you're going to have to choose one of these, I think that this is what, for those of us that are away from this conflict, this is the respect and the distance we need to have, is that, as you said, who would you become in this situation? That is what Burmese people are learning today. Who are they becoming when faced with this? I don't know if I would be a hero, a coward, or a bad guy. I can't say that until I'm in that position. And all I can do from this position is to support those that are making the courageous and honorable decisions in their life, and to also stand back and respect that decision-making process, and something that I've never faced and hope I never will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to some extent that was the question that faced us or that I felt faced us in the late 1960s, early 70s.
Right.
And, people took various radical steps. And they may have been foolish, but they were not motivated by cowardice. And to some extent, it was courageous. It may have been misguided.
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah, for the last topic I want to bring up with you is kind of the other side of the coin of this dilemma. So we're talking now about what some may determine overreach of different Buddhist principles, and perhaps a weighted response in the world as opposed to practice. And now let's look at the other side of that, which is what has been called spiritual bypass, where one is so into their own practice and the internal reality that they are not so responsive to conditions. I spoke last year to Clyde Ford. He's a meditator who was also an anti-racism trainer, and he has done a lot of work on spiritual bypass in the Vipassana community. He defined the term as, quote, using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, or social injustices. I'm curious if you're familiar with the term spiritual bypass, and if so, how you have observed it manifest among spiritual communities you've been a part of.
Well, yeah, of course, I'm familiar with it, and I would agree with that. I would agree with that definition pretty much. I think that, often where we see it is in a kind of, it's not just in a social context. It's often in an individual context, where people allow their practice to cover for the work that they need to be doing on themselves. And to me, that work implies working within society, but even where it doesn't in one or another Buddhist context, it's invoking some idea of the Dharma so that you can avoid dealing with what's right in front of your eyes. So it's actually, one of the things that I've been thinking about for a number of years is, we have this whole mindfulness movement, right? In America, it's still really very much alive. And I think the common understanding of it is mindfulness as an expression of bare awareness. And to me, that's really missing. If we look at the four foundations of mindfulness, the fourth foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of the dharmas, right? These are mindfulness of dharma systems, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, factors of enlightenment, the hindrances, and so forth. And what this means is you put on these systems as if you were putting on a pair of glasses that allowed you to see more clearly. And that brought things into focus. The spiritual bypass is putting on blinders so that you really can't see what's in front of you. Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely it does. I think that's getting at something of the transmission of how the practice is carried over to the West. And this is what's made me reflect, is that fair or unfair in my circles, especially these days when the crisis in Myanmar is so acute, I have to say I'm aware meditators don't generally have the best of reputations, and that they've expressed concern that they find these yogis to be more selfish on average, more focused on their personal needs, such as wanting to find idealized practice environments and focus increasingly attention on their own meditation objects than the real issues before them and others. And this can kind of encourage a cold detachment from the reality that is confronting us. And those few meditators I know that have chose to engage have basically had to divorce themselves from their spiritual communities and teachers and companions. What I'm trying to say is that it's interesting that this kind of behavior has seemed to happen enough among Western practitioners that it has become a kind of trope. It's something that people expect and gets remarked on fairly commonly in conversations I have. This kind of inward, navel-gazing New Ager whose own issues and concerns always need to come first. And if anything, kind of the most egregious example I can think of are those foreign practitioners that I know whose only commentary on the situation in Myanmar is a sadness that they can't come to take the pilgrimage or meditation course they had planned and hope they can do so soon. So my question for you is, how have you found that the transmissions of teachings that have come into the West over the years in terms of developing greater compassion, a sense of service, the mindfulness revolution, but it's actually in some way seems to be reaffirming selfish attitudes where one's own personal needs continue to be prioritized, even if those take a different shape over these matters outside the self. So how can you put these localized examples into a greater historical context of how the teachings have come and settled in the West?
Well, I actually see such a vast difference in a positive way of the evolving Buddhist community in the West. Really different from, say, when I came to Buddhist Peace Fellowship in 1991. And what I see is a much broader awareness of social issues. And certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, a much deeper wrestling with issues of race and diversity and how that fits with the Dharma in this country. That's really, I see that as a development, and I also see it as it's just the beginning of it, because we're still in the process of looking at again, this is an engaged Buddhist perspective, looking at the structural elements that support a status quo of privilege, of white privilege, if you will, male privilege. Those are being chipped away at, but there's so much work to do to actually change and diversify and democratize the structures of our centers, of our institutions. So that work is happening someplace, not happening in other places. It's very uneven, but it's happening in a way that it absolutely was not happening, in 1991. There were just very few people who had these kinds of awarenesses then. So I feel encouraged by that. I think that people who are looking to Myanmar or Thailand or Japan as the places they have to go in order to really do their practice, I think they're just highly deluded. And it's another form. It's a form of what my teachers railed against, the gaining idea. And it's a gaining idea, to feel I have to go to Burma to get the authentic practice. Well, the authentic practice that you're going to get in Burma is already a revisionist practice that was shaped in dialogue with forces of colonialism. It's not, it's not the tradition. It's just we back interpret this idea of tradition and idealize it when, tradition can be very destructive. Or it certainly can be ambiguous. I remember having a pretty sharp argument with a very close friend who I love and respect, when this person wanted to go to practice at one of the meditation centers in Yangon. And this must have been in 1997 or 98. And I said I just didn't feel like that was the right thing to do. And they did it and had a very mixed experience. But, I think we can't go to a meditation place in the middle of a war. And maybe that applies as well here. It certainly applies if what you do is you have your eyes closed to the war that's all around us.
Mm-hmm.
If there's an effort to include that, include the violence and the suffering in society in our practice, which I think is something that I see many teachers trying to do, then there's something more creative happening.
Yeah, in my own experience these past 9 months or so, I've observed a wide range of spiritual bypass that's taking place since the coup. I actually wrote an article for Tricycle about these reflections, and there were 3 categories I identified. I think these are not exact categories. They're just where my observations fit into. And since I've become aware, I think I'd probably add a few more to this after writing it. But of these 3, the first was this misguided belief that because any leadership in Myanmar would be Buddhist and would protect the Dhamma, meditators and monastics don't need to play any supportive role in what one can essentially just regard as a political matter. That's the first form of spiritual bypass, of why one doesn't need to be concerned or focus on this. The second form I've seen is that really the best and the only form of support that meditators should be providing at this time is to sit on the cushion and send metta. And the third form is that because the various Buddhist teachings and lineages have already been sufficiently exported outside of Myanmar and primarily to the West and elsewhere. It's kind of like an unfortunate worldly scenario, what's going on, but we're not really in any concern of losing any Buddhist practice or meditative tradition because we've already taken what we need and established our own authentic communities elsewhere. Some might even argue that those exported communities are better in some ways. But in any case, I wonder what you think about these observations and if you've witnessed examples of spiritual bypass taking place during the current crisis.
Well, I mean, what I always feel is that we have this limitless debt to the teachers and our ancestors who sustained the practice and the ones who brought the practice here from Myanmar, from Thailand, from Japan, from China, from Korea, and so forth. We owe them everything because without their effort, we would not have had an authentic encounter with the Dharma. And they gave their lives, in many cases, they really burned themselves up entirely to transmit the Dharma to us. And our debt to them, which goes back to the country that the countries that they come from, is endless. All of those examples that you told me are just egregious examples of spiritual bypass. They're not seeing the world as it is, and they're not seeing that they are participants. They can be participants in systems of liberation or participants in systems of oppression. It's your choice. This is where one does have an individual choice. So you can't just step back.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this conversation. It's just been wonderful. I want to close with just a final question that is away from some of the harder things I've lobbed at you and just more your personal experience with Myanmar, which you've talked about a bit in some of your answers, but just more personally speaking, I wonder if you can share a bit with the listeners about how you've been impacted by being a practitioner who's come into contact with Burmese monks, who's taken pilgrimages in Myanmar, who's gone to monasteries and pursued meditation there, as the country and society are going through such a difficult time now, just to hear somewhat of a warmer reflection of appreciation and gratitude for those influences that you've been able to enjoy and benefit from based on how the practice has been maintained to this point.
There's a beauty to the country that is extremely varied. I mean, there's so many different landscapes and cultures there. And that's been just a source of wonder for me. And I think one thing that I really see and appreciate is a kind of immediacy and responsiveness of people in every region that I've been to. Very open, certainly with access to joy for the most part. But open. That's not necessarily a characteristic of every society. And I've appreciated that openness and that brightness there's a high level of intelligence. There's humor. And I just feel like I've been privileged to have some experience of this. And I certainly have experienced it to some degree within monastic communities. I've given up on idealization of monastics, particularly idealization of monks. But still, there are many who are they just give. They serve. As we went to go back to Kobodaishi, the mark of a person's enlightenment is in how they serve. And if that's the case, then there are many enlightened monks and people in Myanmar. As I've seen so much wonderful service to children, to the poor, to each other. And I feel very fortunate to have encountered that. It's also true that I've encountered such enormous suffering and grief. And that stays with me as well. And it's like a cloud I'd like to see just blown away. And let's not talk about why this has happened or how this has happened, but it certainly has happened. And there needs to be a unification of the society, and a fundamental, to really dig into the teachings of the Buddha, a fundamental acceptance of the equality of all beings. That's what I wish for. And I see there are people who I feel really can see this, and obviously there are people who can't.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And I've really enjoyed this conversation that's explored so many different backgrounds of your biography and practice, and intersecting what's going on in Myanmar and different spiritual communities in both societies. And is there anything else that we haven't touched upon, or something that you've reflected on later that you want to share before we close?
Yeah. If it would be okay, I'd like to offer a dedication of merit.
Oh, yeah, that'd be wonderful.
In this stormy world of impermanence, this world of discrimination and pandemic, of love and joy, we dedicate the merit of our practice and of our conversation to the awakening of peoples and communities around the world. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be well. May all beings be at peace.
After today's discussion, it should be clear to everyone just how dire the situation is in Myanmar. We are doing our best to shine a light on the ongoing crisis, and we thank you for taking the time to listen. If you found today's talk of value, please consider passing it along to friends in your network. And because our nonprofit is now in a position to transfer funds directly to the protest movement, please also consider letting others know that there is now a way to give that supports the most vulnerable, and to those who are especially impacted by this organized state terror. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are resisting the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Every cent goes immediately and directly to funding those local communities who need it most. Donations go to support such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, and the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies. Or if you prefer, you can earmark your donation to go directly to the guest you just heard on today's show. In order to facilitate this donation work, we have registered a new nonprofit called Better Burma for this express purpose. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is now directed to this fund. Alternatively, you can visit our new Better Burma website, which is betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. In all cases, that's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration.
Yeah.